March 17, 1943. The North Atlantic was a gray, roaring graveyard, waves crashing like angry fists against the steel hulls of the HX-229 convoy. 41 merchant ships pushed through 15-foot swells, each vessel groaning under the weight of 140,000 tons of precious cargo. Food, fuel, ammunition. Everything Britain needed to survive the war. Every ship carried the lifeblood of a nation teetering on the brink of starvation. On the bridge of the SS William Eustace, Captain James Bannerman, a 28-year-old man with years of experience, gripped the railing tightly. The wind whipped rain across his face, the cold gnawing through his coat, and yet he scanned the horizon with unwavering eyes. Somewhere out there, beneath the waves, danger waited. Bannerman didn't know exactly where or how many, but he knew they were coming. Several hundred yards below the icy surface, the German U-boat U-758 lay silent in the water. Inside, Captain Lieutenant Mansack pressed his hands to the cool metal of the hydrophone, headphones clamped tightly over his ears. He listened. The low rumble of ship engines. The rhythmic thrum of propellers turning in the waves. Every vibration, every sound carried through the ocean, a perfect guide for a wolf pack lying in wait. "Contact," whispered the young hydrophone operator, barely audible above the hum of machinery. "Bearing 2. Multiple screws. Heavy machinery noise. Approximately 40 vessels." Mansack smiled, the corners of his lips barely moving. "Prepare the pack," he said softly. "They are ours." Above, Captain Bannerman felt a cold dread settle in his stomach, though he had no idea how precise the coming attack would be. The wolf pack was patient. They did not strike immediately. They waited. They listened. And every turn of the convoy's propellers broadcast their exact position through the dark, frozen Atlantic. And yet, amid this chaos, something unexpected stirred inside one ship. In the galley of the SS William Eustace, a young cook named Thomas "Tommy" Lawson stood scrubbing pots and pans, the smell of soap and salt water heavy in the air. At 28, he was just another man trying to survive in the merchant marine. He had dropped out of school at 14, worked as a line cook in a diner, and now risked his life crossing the Atlantic for triple the pay he could earn back home. But Tommy was not just washing dishes. He was listening. The engines. The propellers. The way the steel hull vibrated under the enormous strain of waves and machinery. Something sounded different. Subtle, almost imperceptible differences in the hum and thrum of the convoy. Every other officer and sailor ignored it, caught in the panic of the storm and the looming threat beneath the waves. But Tommy noticed. He didn't understand exactly what it meant. He didn't know the physics, the engineering, or the military science behind it. But to him, the ocean was speaking in a language he could almost understand. The noise of the ships, the echoes through the water, the way a sinking vessel went silent, it all created a pattern he couldn't shake. Something important. Something no one else had noticed. Outside, the storm lashed the deck. The men struggled to secure cargo, to keep themselves from being thrown overboard. Rain and sea spray froze instantly in the cold wind, a bitter reminder that this part of the Atlantic was no friend to man or machine. And below, Mansack's U-boat waited, silent, deadly, listening for the slightest hint of life above. By now, the crew of HX-229 had no idea how precise the enemy's tracking was. Each merchant ship's propeller cavitation, the low vibrations of the engines, even the resonance of the hull itself acted like a beacon. The Germans did not need to see the ships to destroy them. They only needed to listen. And yet, in this small galley, amid the clang of pots and the hiss of steam, Tommy Lawson had an idea forming in his mind. A small, fragile thought that might change everything. If the ocean itself could carry every sound to the enemy, perhaps the sound could be hidden. Perhaps there was a way to make a ship silent, without anyone knowing. He rubbed his hands together and glanced toward the engine room. If he could figure out the difference between normal ship noise and the noise that stopped when a ship sank, perhaps he could replicate it. He wasn't an engineer. He wasn't an officer. He was just a cook. But sometimes all it took to change history was noticing something everyone else missed. Above the waves, Captain Bannerman tightened his grip and squinted through the storm. Somewhere in the dark waters, dozens of U-boats moved like predators ready to strike. And yet, in the chaos of the Atlantic, a quiet observer in the galley held a secret that could turn the tide of the war, if anyone would listen. What a 28-year-old cook would discover could change the course of the war, Tommy thought, if anyone listened. The waves continued to crash, the wind continued to howl, and the Atlantic waited, silent, deep, and deadly. The North Atlantic had no mercy. Over the next 6 days, the HX-229 convoy and its sister convoy SC-122 would be tested like never before. The waves battered the ships, but it wasn't the storm that threatened the men's lives. It was the hunters beneath the surface. German U-boats moved with deadly precision. The Wolf Pack, a coordinated group of submarines, listened to the convoy's every move. They knew the sound of each ship, the low thrum of engines, the vibration of propellers slicing through the icy waters. It was a perfect acoustic trap. One by one, merchant vessels began to disappear into the depths, torn apart by torpedoes launched silently in the cold, dark night. Captain Bannerman on the SS William Eustis felt the first shudder of torpedo impact on a ship nearby. A column of smoke rose in the distance, and the distant screams of men carried over the waves. 22 ships would be lost in just days, 300 men swallowed by the Atlantic. It was the single worst convoy disaster since the war began, a nightmare the Allies could hardly comprehend. On the German side, Admiral Karl Donitz monitored the attacks with satisfaction. He called it the greatest convoy battle of all time. The numbers were staggering. In March 1943 alone, German submarines sank 567,000 tons of Allied shipping, more than in any other month of the entire war. Britain, heavily dependent on imported food and fuel, teetered on the brink of starvation. Only 3 months of food remained in the nation's stores. If the convoy system failed, surrender would be inevitable. Prime Minister Winston Churchill would later write in his memoirs that the U-boat peril was the only thing that truly frightened him during the war. It was not the beaches of Normandy or the skies over London. It was these dark, frigid waters, where the Allies were powerless and every mistake meant death. The Allied command tried everything. Destroyers and corvettes equipped with ASDIC, the early form of sonar, scoured the waters. Radio silence was enforced. Convoys zigzagged desperately to confuse the enemy. High-frequency direction-finding equipment, nicknamed Huff Duff, tracked enemy radio signals. But nothing worked. The ocean was a perfect conductor for sound, and the submarines only had to sit quietly and wait. And while the best scientists, engineers, and admirals in the Allied forces racked their brains, Tommy Lawson continued to notice something no one else did. He was in the engine room, crouched near the massive turbines, listening to the vibrations traveling through the steel hull. He observed the subtle changes when a ship began to sink, how the violent vibrations of machinery and propellers suddenly quieted as water rushed in. It was an idea so simple, so strange that no officer could take it seriously. "It's impossible," one engineer said dismissively. "We can't make a ship quiet enough to fool a U-boat." The experts were wrong. Tommy, a cook with no formal education in engineering or acoustics, had stumbled on a principle no one else had seen. Water absorbs vibrations far better than air or steel. The sound of a ship could, in theory, be hidden if it was dampened correctly. Yet he kept his thoughts to himself. Officers were too busy mourning the losses of ships and men. Crews focused on survival. And the U-boats continued to stalk the convoy undeterred. The Atlantic became a graveyard of steel and wood, but in the corner of the SS William Eustis, a quiet mind was forming a solution. By March 15, the Allied command had accepted what they thought was an unchangeable truth. Merchant ships were too loud. Convoys would continue to announce their position to every listening U-boat within miles. Every strategy they tried had failed. Hope was dwindling. And yet, hope was exactly what Tommy Lawson was about to provide. His observations, his patience, and his unusual attention to sound patterns in the engine room had given him an edge that no one in the high command possessed. The solution would not come from expensive sonar, radio tracking, or complex engineering. It would come from a man who knew nothing of war strategy, but everything about noticing details others ignored. As the convoy limped through the icy Atlantic, smoke rising from torpedoed vessels and bodies clinging to lifeboats, Tommy quietly sketched ideas in a worn notebook. How could water be used to muffle machinery? Could a ship be modified to carry itself silently through the ocean, invisible to the enemy's deadly ears? No one took him seriously. But as Captain Bannerman looked out at the carnage, he had no idea that somewhere in his own crew, a solution to the greatest naval disaster of the Atlantic was quietly taking shape. The Wolf Pack would continue to hunt, torpedoes would continue to strike, and men would continue to die. But in the shadows of chaos, Tommy Lawson began to write the first lines of an invention that would save thousands of lives. And the Atlantic waited, dark and indifferent, unaware that a simple idea from a ship's cook would one day turn the tide of the war. Cliffhanger. While 22 ships sank and hundreds of men perished, no one suspected that a quiet observer in the galley might hold the key to survival and the war's fate. Amid the chaos of the North Atlantic, while torpedoes tore apart merchant ships and men clung to lifeboats in the freezing water, Tommy Lawson quietly did what no one else thought important. He listened. Tommy was not an officer. He was not a scientist. Not even an engineer. He was a cook. A high school dropout from South Boston who had joined the Merchant Marine for triple the pay he could earn back home. He had spent his life chopping vegetables, scrambling eggs for 50 men, and braving storms at sea to deliver food to faraway ports. He had no formal knowledge of physics, no understanding of naval acoustics, and certainly no rank that commanded respect in the Royal Navy. Yet, here he was in the heart of the storm, crouched near the roaring turbines of the SS William Eustace's engine room. The heat pressed against him, the steel beneath his hands vibrating violently, but he was focused. Every note, every vibration, every hum of the engines and turning of the propeller blades was a clue. He listened to the sound that traveled through the steel hull and into the water, carrying the convoy's location straight to the enemy's ears. He had noticed something remarkable. During one convoy, a ship struck by a torpedo began to flood. Tommy had heard the low rumble of the machinery fade, the constant thrum of the propeller die away, until the ship was silent beneath the waves. It was as if the ocean itself had swallowed the ship's voice. No scientist, no officer, no engineer had ever made this observation. To everyone else it was just a sinking ship. To Tommy it was a revelation. Water, he realized, absorbed vibration. It dampened sound. If a ship could somehow control where water was inside its hull, perhaps it could move silently, invisible to the listening U-boats. He spent hours after his galley duties observing, crouched near the machinery, scribbling notes in a worn notebook. His hands ached, his eyes burned, but he could not stop. He compared the vibrations of ships that were fine, ships that had started taking on water, and the engines of vessels at rest. Patterns emerged, patterns that no expert had noticed, because experts were looking at technology, charts and statistics, not listening with their hands, feet and intuition. The other crew members thought he was mad. "Tommy, get out of there before you get crushed," said First Mate Robert Chin, shaking his head as he watched the cook crouch near the main shaft. "This engine room is hotter than hell and the ship is rolling like a drunk. You're going to get yourself killed." "I'm fine," Tommy muttered, barely lifting his head. He didn't need to explain. He knew what he was hearing. He could feel the resonance in his feet, the way the steel beneath him carried sound into the ocean. To him it was like tasting ingredients in a soup, subtle, precise, revealing hidden truths. Captain Bannerman barely noticed him. His mind was consumed by the storm, the torpedoes, and the cargo that had to reach Britain at any cost. Officers argued over zigzag patterns, sonar readings and radio silence. The Admiralty was desperate. Experts had concluded there was no way to quiet the ships. The acoustic signatures were too loud, too complex. Every plan had failed. The Atlantic was a graveyard and there seemed no hope. But Tommy had hope. It was fragile, quiet, almost unbelievable. He sketched ideas in the margins of his notebook. Small chambers of water placed near the main engine mounts, rubber bladders pressed against machinery, the controlled flooding of certain areas to absorb vibration. He didn't know if it would work. He didn't know if anyone would listen. But he knew the principle: water absorbs sound better than steel or air. And if he could control it, he could hide the ship's noise from the U-boats. Each night, after finishing his galley duties, he returned to the engine room, ignoring the cold, ignoring the danger. He measured vibrations with his hands, noted the subtle changes in tone and refined his sketches. To the world he was just a cook. To the war he was quietly crafting a plan that could save thousands of lives. And the U-boats continued their deadly hunt. Torpedoes ripped through hulls, smoke and fire filled the night, men drowned in icy waters. HX-229 and SC-122 were losing ships faster than the Allies could replace them. Every convoy that survived did so by sheer luck, by the bravery of crews, and by the unseen hand of a cook who noticed what others ignored. Tommy did not yet know how to present his idea. He did not yet know if the Admiralty would ever listen to a simple American cook. But he knew one thing: the Atlantic had secrets and he was beginning to understand them. And one day that understanding could save lives. More lives than any ship, any weapon or any officer could save alone. The ocean was dark. The storm raged. U-boats listened. And one man in the galley was paying attention when no one else would. Cliffhanger: Tommy Lawson had discovered something extraordinary, but would anyone in the War Command believe a cook could outsmart the deadliest weapon in the Atlantic? By late March 1943, the North Atlantic had claimed dozens of ships and hundreds of lives. HX-229 and SC-122 were a grim testament to the U-boat menace, and the Allied command was desperate. Officers and scientists argued endlessly over sonar readings, convoy patterns and experimental devices. Every strategy had failed. Every plan had crumbled. The ocean, cold and indifferent, had swallowed thousands of men and still the U-boats prowled undetected. Yet aboard the SS William Eustis, one man remained undeterred. Thomas "Tommy" Lawson, the ship's cook, had been quietly observing the vibrations, the hum of engines, and the way sound traveled through steel into the Atlantic. He had scribbled diagrams, sketches of chambers and bladders filled with water to absorb vibrations. He didn't call them experiments. They were ideas, crude but promising, born of observation and intuition rather than formal training. For weeks, he had tested them silently in his mind, imagining how water could dampen the ship's machinery and hide its noise from the enemy's hydrophones. Each time a ship struck a torpedo and began to sink, he observed the silence that followed. It was proof of the principle. Water absorbs vibration far better than air or steel. The ocean itself had revealed the secret, and Tommy had finally understood it. But understanding was not enough. The Admiralty had dismissed every idea they had not devised themselves. Naval engineers called it impossible. Acoustic scientists said it violated every known principle of ship design. Officers believed that a cook, no matter how clever, had no place offering solutions to the war. To them, Tommy was nothing more than a man who fried eggs and washed dishes. Still he persisted. He approached First Mate Robert Chin one cold morning, waving his notebook. "Look at this," he said, pointing to his sketches. "If we create sealed water chambers around the propeller shafts, press rubber bladders against the engines, we can block the vibrations. We can make a ship silent, invisible to the U-boats." Chin frowned, shaking his head. "You want to flood parts of this ship while it's at sea? Are you insane? You'll sink us yourself before the U-boats even touch us." "I'm not talking about flooding," Tommy said firmly. "Controlled chambers. Still, only enough to absorb the vibrations. Just like when a ship sinks, it goes quiet. I can make it quiet without sinking it." Chin laughed. "You're a cook, Tommy. Stay in the galley. Leave the engineering to the engineers. That's madness." But Tommy could not let it go. He knew the stakes. Thousands of men were dying, ships were being lost, and the official experts had no answers. If his idea worked, it could save lives, change the tide of the Battle of the Atlantic, and keep Britain from starvation. Finally, he decided he had to speak to someone who mattered. Dressing in his cleanest uniform, he walked into the Western Approaches Command headquarters in Liverpool, clutching his notebook. Guards stopped him immediately. "You can't be here," one officer barked, grabbing his arm. "Restricted area. Step aside or we'll arrest you." Tommy's voice was urgent. "Please, you have to listen. I have an idea, something that could hide our ships from the U-boats." The guards exchanged skeptical glances, ready to throw him out. But then a voice cut through. "Wait." Commander Peter Gretton, a seasoned Royal Navy officer, had been returning from a harrowing convoy battle. His face was lined with exhaustion, his eyes hollow from witnessing loss after loss. But desperation made him listen. "You said something about convoy noise?" Gretton asked, his voice sharp but curious. "Explain." Tommy explained quickly, pointing at his sketches, his words tumbling out in a mix of fear and determination. He described the engine room, the vibrations, the way water absorbs sound. He showed how controlled water chambers and rubber bladders could silence a ship's machinery, making it nearly undetectable to German hydrophones. Gretton's eyes narrowed. He listened carefully, disbelief written across his face. A cook, a high school dropout, talking about acoustic dampening like a seasoned engineer. But there was something in Tommy's words, precision, observation, logic. Something that no one else had noticed. "You're saying we can hide ships from U-boats, without new technology, without rebuilding the engines?" Gretton asked cautiously. "Yes, sir," Tommy said, his voice steady now, though his hands trembled slightly. "Just placement, water, vibration control. That's it. It's simple. And I've tested it in the engine room. It works in principle." Gretton stared at him. The room seemed to hold its breath. Experts around them whispered, skeptical and dismissive, but Gretton's mind raced. If this worked, it could save thousands of lives. If it failed, they would all face the consequences. "Show me," Gretton said finally. "We'll test it. Small scale on a ship in dry dock. If it works, we take it to the convoy." Tommy nodded, relief washing over him. This was the chance he had been waiting for. Weeks of observation, sketches, and silent calculations were about to be tested. The idea that had been dismissed as madness might finally meet reality. As he left the boardroom, Tommy felt a strange mix of fear and hope. The ocean was still a deadly place. U-boats still lurked beneath the waves. But now, armed with an idea born of observation and courage, a cook might outsmart the deadliest weapon in the Atlantic. Cliffhanger: would the idea of a single cook be enough to silence the ocean's most lethal hunters, or would it cost more lives than anyone could save? The dry docks of Liverpool were cold and gray in late March 1943. Smoke from nearby ships mingled with the damp sea air, and the constant clanging of hammers echoed through the shipyard. Amid the chaos of wartime production, HMS Sunflower, a small corvette, sat in a basin, its hull exposed and vulnerable. On its deck stood Commander Peter Gretton and Thomas "Tommy" Lawson, the cook whose idea had challenged everything naval experts believed possible. The skeptics had stayed away. Naval architects muttered that the experiment was madness, engineers called it a recipe for disaster, and officers whispered about court-martials. But Gretton knew they had no choice. U-boats were sinking ships faster than Britain could replace them. Thousands of lives depended on success, or at least on trying something new. "All right, cook," Gretton said, his tone firm but not unkind. "We'll do it your way. Let's see if a high school dropout can outsmart a German U-boat." Tommy's hands shook slightly as he supervised a team of welders. They installed crude steel chambers around the ship's main propeller shafts, sealing them tight to hold seawater. Heavy rubber bladders were pressed against the engines and steamline mounts. It was simple, almost primitive, but Tommy knew the principle. Water absorbs vibration. If they positioned it right, the ship would become invisible to enemy ears. "This won't hold," muttered Lieutenant James Whitby, the ship's chief engineer. "Water inside steel cages? Bladders pressing against the engines? It's going to shake apart under full speed." Tommy didn't argue. He simply observed, adjusted placement, and checked for leaks. Every pipe, every seam mattered. One mistake could flood the engine room, capsize the ship, or make the test useless. The weight alone added 18 tons to the vessel. Every decision was critical. On April 2, 1943, the first real test began. HMS Sunflower slipped from its dry dock into the muddy Mersey River, moving slowly, carefully, under Gretton's watchful eyes. Nearby, HMS Trespasser, a British submarine, submerged quietly 500 yards away. Its hydrophones were active, ready to listen for every thrum, every hum of the corvette's machinery. Tommy stood on deck, heart pounding, hands gripping the rail. He could feel the vibrations of the engine beneath his feet, the low thrum of the propeller, the steam piping humming in resonance. This was it. The first moment of truth. Minutes passed. The submarine's captain signaled to Gretton, "Clear as day, sir." Engine noise same as always. "Failure." Gretton's face sank. Whitby muttered, "Told you it was stupid." Tommy's eyes did not leave the ship. Something was wrong. The water in the chambers, he realized, had leaked slightly through the seams during installation. Not enough water remained to fully absorb the vibrations. He turned to the welders. "Seal them. Watertight. Do it now." 3 days of frantic work followed. The crew welded, hammered, and sealed, ensuring every chamber could hold water under pressure. Every rubber bladder was secured, every seam double-checked. Tommy oversaw each step, insisting on perfection. On April 5, the corvette returned to the river for the second test. Full speed this time. Trespasser submerged again, hydrophones active, waiting to detect the slightest sound. Minutes stretched like hours. Tommy clenched the railing. Gretton's face was pale. Whitby's jaw was tight. The submarine's captain signaled. Silence. Complete silence. Gretton stepped closer to Tommy, disbelief etched on his face. "Say that again," he whispered. Tommy swallowed hard. "At full speed, they can't hear us. Not even a trace." The result was clear. The water-filled chambers and rubber bladders had absorbed the vibrations. The corvette's machinery no longer screamed into the ocean. For the first time, a ship was effectively invisible to hydrophones. The principle had worked. It's impossible," Whitby muttered, shaking his head. "We've spent millions on sonar, huff-duff, propeller redesigns, and this, Cook's idea, works better than all of it." Gretton allowed himself a rare smile. "Cook or not, Mr. Lawson, you've just changed the game. If this scales to the convoy, thousands of lives will be saved." Tommy felt a mixture of relief and fear. This was only the first test. Success here did not guarantee the system would survive the open Atlantic, torpedoes, storms, and the cunning of U-boat commanders. But it was proof of concept, a spark of hope in a war that had seemed hopeless. The next step was clear. 6 merchant ships would be modified with Tommy's acoustic dampening system and sent into a real convoy. No one outside the small test team could know. If the system worked in combat, it could save thousands. If it failed, the blame would fall squarely on the shoulders of a cook who had dared to challenge every expert in Britain. Gretton placed a firm hand on Tommy's shoulder. "Prepare your plans. We move fast. The convoy departs in 8 days. This is your chance to prove what you saw in the engine room isn't just luck. It's genius." Tommy nodded, feeling the weight of responsibility. He was not a captain. He was not an officer. But now, more than ever, he was the key to survival. The ocean remained a dangerous, dark place, and thousands of men would be counting on him. Cliffhanger: 6 ships. A risky experiment. The deadliest hunters of the Atlantic lying in wait. Would the silence of a single cook save them, or would the ocean claim another 100 lives? April 22, 1943. The port of Liverpool was alive with the hurried energy of wartime departure. Convoy ONS 184-43 merchant ships escorted by 6 corvettes and 2 destroyers, was preparing to cross the Atlantic. Among them, 6 ships had been secretly modified with Tommy Lawson's acoustic dampening system. No one outside the test team knew. Not the convoy commodore. Not the crew. Not the lurking U-boats, spread in patrol lines across the expected route. Tommy stood on the deck of his ship, the SS William Eustace, watching the harbor recede. The salty wind whipped his uniform and the gray waves stretched endlessly ahead. His heart pounded, not just from fear but from anticipation. The real test had begun. Below the waves, 37 German U-boats of Wolfpack Mesa lay in wait. Their hydrophones were active, ears tuned to the familiar hum of propellers and engines, the acoustic signatures that had guided them to countless kills. For years, these Wolfpacks had hunted with terrifying precision. Tonight they expected the same. The convoy slipped into open water, each ship following a strict formation. On the surface, the sea appeared calm, but beneath, the hunt was already underway. Captain Hartwig of U-264, a veteran of the Atlantic, adjusted his hydrophones. "I have contact," his operator whispered, "but some ships are different. Weak, almost silent. Impossible." Hartwig frowned. He had heard convoys before, tracked them for hours, known exactly how far away each ship was. Yet here, in the dead of night, his instruments betrayed him. 6 ships scattered among the convoy were producing almost no noise. He blinked, certain his hydrophones were malfunctioning. But no, others reported the same. The quiet ships seemed invisible. Meanwhile, Tommy moved among the crew of the William Eustace, checking the water-filled chambers, the rubber bladders, ensuring every system was performing as expected. He could feel the hum of the engines dampened by the modifications. For the first time he understood the power of his simple idea. A ship that should have screamed across the ocean now whispered, silent enough to confuse the deadliest hunters of the Atlantic. The first attack came in the early hours. Explosions shattered the night as U-boats struck. Torpedoes tore through the formation. The unmodified ships became targets instantly. One merchant vessel listed, then sank, taking her cargo and crew with her. Another caught fire. The cries of men in the water were carried by the wind. The U-boat commanders were skilled, calculating, and ruthless. Yet the 6 modified ships remained untouched. The U-boats circled, hydrophones straining, but they could not locate them. They adjusted angles, changed depths, tried to triangulate signals. Nothing. The ships were ghosts. The convoy commodore noticed the pattern. 2 starboard, 2 port, 2 in the center, completely undetectable. On the William Eustace, Tommy felt a mix of fear and triumph. He knew that every minute of survival mattered. If even one of the modifications failed, it could mean disaster. But every time he checked, every chamber held water, every bladder stayed in place. The system worked flawlessly under combat conditions. Hours dragged into a brutal, relentless chase. The U-boats attacked, missed, and retreated only to try again. Surface skirmishes, sonar pings, and distant explosions became the rhythm of the night. By dawn, the convoy had endured hours of attacks. 9 unmodified ships had been sunk. 3,000 men were in lifeboats, clinging to debris, their lives hanging by a thread. But the 6 silent ships, Tommy's ships, had survived unscathed. Not a single torpedo struck them. Their engines had whispered into the ocean, too quiet for detection, too subtle to trace. The principle that had begun as a cook's observation in an engine room had proven itself under the harshest conditions imaginable. Commander Gretton, observing from the bridge of an escort corvette, allowed himself a rare smile. He sent a coded signal to London. Modified vessels show zero enemy engagement despite similar positions within convoy formation. Acoustic dampening effective under combat conditions. Recommend immediate fleet-wide implementation. Tommy finally allowed himself to breathe. The sea was still treacherous, the U-boats still deadly, but for the first time hope had returned. Lives had been saved, not by more guns, not by more technology, but by understanding the ocean itself. In Germany, Captain Hartwig and his fellow commanders were baffled. Their hydrophones, their decades of experience had failed. The Atlantic had grown silent in the wrong places, and the hunters had become the hunted. Confusion spread through the wolf pack. Losses would soon mount. Tactics that had worked for years were now useless. As the convoy continued toward New York, Tommy looked over the deck. The crew remained unaware of the full significance of what they had survived. He smiled faintly, thinking of the men who would see home again because of this experiment. A high school dropout, a cook, had changed naval warfare forever. Cliffhanger: 6 ships survived. Thousands of men were saved. But could a simple idea scale across an entire fleet and finally turn the tide of the Atlantic? Or would the Germans adapt before it was too late? By May 1943, the Atlantic was a battlefield like no other. Convoys still braved storms and enemy submarines, but a quiet revolution had begun. Tommy Lawson's acoustic dampening system was no longer an experiment. 6 ships had survived their first real convoy test. Now the Allies faced a critical question. Could this simple innovation save the fleet and turn the tide of the war? In Liverpool, dry docks were filled with Liberty ships waiting for modifications. Welders, engineers, and naval crews worked around the clock to install water-filled chambers and rubber bladders on hundreds of vessels. Tommy supervised tirelessly, moving from ship to ship, ensuring each system was installed exactly as he had designed. Every bolt, every seam mattered. Mistakes could cost lives. The skeptics were still vocal. Naval architects warned of stability problems, corrosion, and unforeseen mechanical failures. Engineers muttered that the system was makeshift and unscientific. But the evidence could not be ignored. The modified ships were proving themselves against the deadliest hunters in the Atlantic. For the first time, the convoy system had a real advantage. May 24th became known in Germany as Black May. U-boat commanders watched in horror as their wolf packs suffered devastating losses. Ships that had once screamed across the ocean now slipped by silently. The enemy could not coordinate attacks because the acoustic signatures they relied upon were gone. Losses mounted. 41 U-boats were sunk in just 30 days, 25% of Germany's operational submarine fleet. The hunters had become the hunted. On board the William Eustace, Tommy watched the waves, feeling a mix of exhaustion and quiet pride. He was not a captain, not an officer, not even a trained engineer. He was a cook who had noticed something everyone else missed. And that simple observation had saved thousands of lives. Commander Peter Gretton sent another message to London. Fleet-wide implementation successful. Acoustic dampening drastically reduces U-boat detection range. Convoy losses plummet. Recommend immediate expansion. Across the Atlantic, Admiral Sir Max Horton reviewed the numbers. Convoy losses had dropped from 729 ships in the previous 8 months to 329 after the system was implemented. Over 4,200 merchant seamen had been saved, lives that would have been lost without a cook's insight. Horton was a man of few words, but even he could not hide his admiration. Lawson, however, remained humble. He never sought credit, never asked for recognition. After the war, he returned to Boston and opened a small diner in Dorchester. He married, raised 3 children, and lived quietly. The world did not know the full story. Even his own wife did not learn the truth until 1978, when a British naval historian tracked him down. Awards were given, medals were distributed, but Tommy refused interviews. When asked by the New York Times in 1947, he sent a brief note. "I just noticed something and mentioned it. Other people did the real work." Yet the legacy of his innovation was undeniable. The principles of liquid acoustic dampening evolved into modern naval noise reduction systems, still in use on warships today. Modern technology replaced static water chambers with compressed air bubbles, but the physics remained the same: create a barrier to mask machinery noise and survive the silent hunter beneath the waves. In London, retired officers remembered him quietly. At his funeral in 1991, 3 elderly British naval officers who had served in convoy escorts attended. One placed a small handwritten note in his casket: "Because of you we came home." The story of Thomas Patrick Lawson is a reminder that innovation does not require titles or formal education. It requires observation, courage, and the willingness to challenge assumptions. During the darkest days of the Battle of the Atlantic, a simple idea, a cook noticing the hum of engines, saved thousands of lives and changed the course of history. The ocean remained a place of danger even after the war, but for a brief moment, it had also been a canvas for ingenuity. Tommy Lawson's quiet genius transformed fear into hope. The hunters had become the hunted, and a single voice, one that no one expected, had been enough to tip the balance. Closing suspense, the Atlantic would continue to rage, U-boats would continue to hunt, and war would continue to claim lives. But in the silence created by one man's insight, thousands found safety. Sometimes, it takes one person noticing what everyone else misses to change the course of history.